The crowds had been following Jesus all day, from villages, from fishing towns, from dusty roads stretching across Galilee. Everywhere he went now, people gathered. The sick wanted healing, the poor wanted hope, the religious leaders wanted answers, and everyone wanted to hear him speak. Hour after hour, Jesus stood beside the Sea of Galilee teaching massive crowds through stories and parables. Farmers, fishermen, children, merchants, Roman taxed laborers exhausted from life beneath occupation. They packed the shoreline so tightly that Jesus eventually stepped into a boat just to create space between himself and the people. And still they listened. As the sun slowly drifted lower across the water, Jesus continued teaching. The kingdom of God, faith, seeds, lamps, hidden things becoming revealed. The crowds hung on to every word. But while the people listened, the disciples watched something else. They watched exhaustion settle onto Jesus himself. Because despite the miracles, despite the authority, despite the crowds, Jesus was still fully human. And he was tired. As evening approached, Jesus finally turned toward his disciples and said, "Let us go over to the other side." Simple words, but those words meant entering the lake at night, and the Sea of Galilee was not always gentle. The disciples knew this better than anyone. Several of them had spent most of their lives on these waters. Peter knew these waves. Andrew knew these winds. James and John had likely crossed this lake hundreds of times before ever meeting Jesus. But Galilee had a reputation. The lake sat low beneath surrounding hills and mountains. Cold air rushing downward could collide violently with warm air rising from the water. Storms could appear without warning, and when they came fast. Still, the disciples obeyed. The crowds slowly faded behind them as the boat drifted farther from shore. Other small boats followed nearby. The last light of sunset reflected softly across the water. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Jesus moved toward the back of the boat. A cushion rested there near the stern, and almost immediately, he fell asleep. It is one of the most human moments in the entire gospel story. The Son of God, asleep from exhaustion inside a small fishing boat. Meanwhile, the disciples continued across the darkening water. Some likely adjusted the sails, others steered. The lake stretched black beneath the night sky. The shoreline became distant. And then, the wind changed. At first it was subtle, a stronger gust, a colder current of air. Small waves began tapping harder against the boat. The fishermen noticed immediately. They exchanged glances. Something was coming. Suddenly, the storm exploded across the lake. Wind screamed over the water. Waves slammed into the boat with violent force. Rain blasted across the disciples' faces. Thunder cracked overhead. The peaceful crossing instantly became chaos. The boat pitched violently side to side. Water poured across the deck. The disciples fought desperately to keep control. Experienced fishermen grabbed ropes and sails. Others bailed water as fast as possible. But the storm kept growing stronger. The Gospel of Mark says the waves were already breaking into the boat, meaning this was no minor storm. The vessel itself was beginning to fill. And somewhere in the middle of the chaos, Jesus was still asleep. That detail almost feels unbelievable. The disciples were fighting for their lives, and Jesus remained asleep through the roar of wind and crashing water. Peter likely shouted over the storm. John struggled to keep balance. Every wave threatened to throw them into the sea. And slowly, a terrifying realization settled into the minds of the disciples. They might actually die here. Finally, the disciples rushed toward Jesus, soaked, panicked, desperate. One account records them crying out, "Lord, save us! We are perishing!" Another says, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" You can hear the fear in those words, and maybe even frustration, because from their perspective, Jesus appeared completely unconcerned while they drowned. These were hardened fishermen, men familiar with storms, men who understood boats, and even they were terrified. The storm had pushed them beyond their own abilities, beyond their own experience, beyond their own control. And perhaps that was exactly the point. Jesus opened his eyes. He stood slowly inside the violently shaking boat. Wind tore across his clothes. Rain struck his face. Lightning flashed across the sky. And then Jesus spoke to the disciples first. "Why are you afraid? Oh, you of little faith." Imagine hearing those words while waves tower around you. But Jesus was exposing something deeper than fear of drowning. The disciples had already seen miracles. They had seen demons cast out. They had seen sickness obey him. Yet somehow they still had not fully understood who was standing beside them. Then Jesus turned toward the storm itself, toward the screaming wind, toward the raging sea, and he rebuked them. "Peace, be still." Instantly, everything stopped. Not gradually, not naturally, immediately. The wind vanished. The waves flattened. The thunder ceased. The sea became perfectly calm. A moment earlier, the disciples were screaming over hurricane-force winds. Now, only silence remained. The boat drifted gently across still water beneath the night sky. And suddenly, the disciples were no longer most afraid of the storm. They were afraid of him. The Gospel accounts say the disciples were filled with awe. Some translations say fear, because they realized something impossible had just happened. Men can survive storms. Men can navigate storms. But no man commands storms. Yet the wind had obeyed Jesus instantly. The sea itself had submitted to his voice, and the disciples whispered to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" That question sits at the center of the entire story. Not merely, can Jesus do miracles? But, who exactly is Jesus? Because throughout the Old Testament, authority over the sea belonged to God alone. The Psalms describe God ruling the raging waters. The book of Job describes God commanding creation itself. And now, standing inside a small fishing boat, Jesus had done the same thing with only his words. The storm obeyed him because creation recognized its creator. The storm on Galilee lasted only a short time, but the lesson remained with the disciples forever. Because one day they would face persecution, prison, violence, martyrdom, fear. And they would remember the night the sea obeyed his voice. The story was never only about weather. It was about trust, about fear, about discovering who Jesus truly was. The disciples entered that boat believing Jesus was a teacher sent from God. But they stepped onto the far shore asking a far bigger question. What kind of man commands the wind and the sea? And the gospel answer becomes clear. This was no ordinary man. This was the one whom even creation obeyed. And as the boat drifted across the silent water, the disciples understood something they would never forget. The storm had not revealed the power of the sea. It had revealed the power of the one standing above it. And beneath the stars over Galilee, for the first time, They began to truly understand who Jesus was. The question is, do you? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you want to go even deeper into these mysteries, click one of the videos on your screen now and keep watching. I'll see you in the next one.